The morning frost still clung to the birch trees when Corporal Eero Virtanen positioned himself behind what Finnish soldiers had started calling the elephant gun, a description that barely captured the violence contained in the Lahti L-39 anti-tank rifle he'd carried to this position overlooking the frozen lake. February 6, 1940. Temperature -28 degrees Celsius. The weapon stretched nearly 2.5 meters from buttstock to muzzle, weighed 23 kilograms without ammunition, and fired a 20 by 138 millimeter B cartridge capable of punching through armor plate at ranges where conventional rifles were throwing harmless metal at steel barriers. But what made Virtanen's particular L-39 exceptional wasn't the weapon's already formidable specifications, it was the experimental elephant gun barrel that Finnish armorer Henrik Laaksonen had fitted 3 days earlier, a barrel that extended the weapon's length by an additional 30 centimeters and promised to transform the L-39's already devastating performance into something approaching artillery-level penetration. Virtanen was 32 years old that morning, which made him ancient by infantry standards, where most Finnish soldiers defending against the Soviet invasion were barely out of their teens. He'd been hunting elk in these same forests when mobilization came in September 1939, and that hunting experience, the patience, the cold weather endurance, the ability to estimate range across snow-covered terrain, had gotten him assigned to anti-tank duties when his unit received its first L-39 rifles in December. The weapon had been adopted by the Finnish military only 2 years earlier in 1939, designed specifically to counter the armor that Finland knew Soviet tanks would bring if war came. And war had come, exactly as predicted, with Soviet armor leading assaults that conventional rifles couldn't slow, and that required specialized weapons capable of defeating steel protection. The Lahti L-39 represented Finnish weapons designer Aimo Lahti's response to armor threats that were transforming infantry combat across Europe. Tank warfare had evolved rapidly during the 1930s, with armor thickness increasing and tactical employment becoming more sophisticated. Infantry needed portable weapons that could engage tanks without depending on artillery or dedicated anti-tank guns that couldn't keep pace with mobile operations. Anti-tank rifles emerged as one solution, large-caliber rifles that individual soldiers or small teams could carry and employ against armored vehicles at ranges where the armor was vulnerable and where positioning allowed flanking shots against thinner side or rear protection. The L-39 design reflected Finland's particular requirements and industrial capabilities. The weapon fired the 20 by 138 millimeter B cartridge, a sound substantially larger than the typical anti-tank rifle calibers that other nations employed. German anti-tank rifles used 7.92 by 94 millimeters. British Boys rifles fired .55 caliber rounds. Polish VZ-35 used 7.92 by 107 millimeters. The L-39's 20 millimeters represented a significant increase in projectile diameter and energy, creating a weapon that delivered roughly 3 times the kinetic energy of comparable anti-tank rifles, while accepting the weight and recoil penalties that such power demanded. The weapon operated on a gas-driven mechanism similar to the Lahti Saloranta machine gun, using propellant gases tapped from the barrel to cycle the action semi-automatically. The gas system drove a piston that extracted the fired cartridge, ejected it, and chambered a fresh round from the 10-round detachable box magazine, creating what was essentially a semi-automatic cannon that one soldier could operate. The weapon included a bipod for stability during firing, a padded shoulder rest to absorb some of the brutal recoil, and iron sights graduated for ranges up to 1,500 meters, though practical engagement distances were considerably shorter. The standard L-39 barrel measured approximately 1.3 meters, creating an overall weapon length of 2.24 meters. This length was necessary to achieve the velocity required for armor penetration, The 20mm projectile needed to impact armor at speeds exceeding 800 meters per second to have any chance of punching through the steel protection that Soviet tanks carried. Shorter barrels would reduce velocity and compromise penetration, making the weapon ineffective against its intended targets. But even the standard barrel's length didn't generate velocities that Finnish weapons developers considered optimal for engaging the increasingly thick armor that intelligence reports suggested Soviet tanks would employ. The elephant gun barrel modification that Henrik Laaksonen had developed during late 1939 extended the standard barrel by an additional 30 centimeters, bringing total barrel length to approximately 1.6 meters and overall weapon length to nearly 2.55 meters. The extended barrel allowed propellant gases more time and distance to accelerate the projectile before it left the muzzle, theoretically increasing impact velocity by roughly 50 to 70 meters per second, depending on ammunition batch and atmospheric conditions. This velocity increase translated to improved armor penetration, perhaps an additional 3 to 5 millimeters of penetration at typical combat ranges, which could mean the difference between a projectile bouncing off armor and successfully penetrating to damage internal components or injure crew members. However, the extended barrel created complications that went beyond simply making an already cumbersome weapon even more unwieldy. The additional 30 centimeters of steel tubing added approximately 1.5 kilograms to the weapon's weight, bringing total loaded weight to nearly 25 kilograms, a burden that made the L-39 even more exhausting to carry across the snow-covered forests where Finnish forces operated. The extended length made maneuvering through dense vegetation more difficult, with the muzzle catching on branches and undergrowth that the standard-length weapon could clear. The longer barrel created different harmonic vibrations during firing, potentially affecting accuracy in ways that Laaksonen's testing hadn't fully characterized. Most significantly, the extended barrel increased the already savage recoil that made the L-39 one of the most punishing weapons any infantry soldier was expected to fire repeatedly. The 20 by 138 mmB cartridge generated roughly 350 joules of recoil energy when fired from a standard barrel, approximately 5 times what a standard rifle produced, and enough to cause bruising or injury if the weapon wasn't held correctly. The extended barrel's additional weight helped absorb some recoil through increased inertia, but the higher velocity meant the projectile carried more momentum that had to be balanced by rearward weapon movement. Soldiers firing the elephant gun barrel reported that recoil felt sharper and more violent than the standard configuration, creating a firing experience that was already brutal, made noticeably worse. Virtanen had test-fired his elephant gun L-39 only once before this morning's combat employment, a single magazine of 10 rounds expended at a makeshift range where he'd engaged steel plates at 300 meters to verify that the rifle was zeroed and that he could manage the enhanced recoil. The firing experience had been memorable for all the wrong reasons. The first shot had driven the padded shoulder rest so hard against his collarbone that he'd thought something had broken. The muzzle blast was louder than he'd anticipated, creating pressure waves that made his ears ring despite the thick winter cap he wore. By the 10th shot, his shoulder felt like someone had been hitting it with a hammer, and his cheek was sore from being pressed hard against the stock during recoil. The penetration had been impressive. The steel plates they'd used for targets, roughly 8 millimeters thick, salvaged from somewhere, had been punctured cleanly at 300 meters, with the 20mm projectiles leaving holes the size of a thumb and creating jagged exit damage on the backside. Laaksonen had estimated that the elephant gun barrel would provide roughly 15 millimeters of penetration at 300 meters against properly hardened armor plate, and perhaps 12 millimeters at 500 meters, performance that should defeat the frontal armor of Soviet light tanks like the T-26, and potentially penetrate the side armor of heavier vehicles if angles and impact points were favorable. The tactical situation on the morning of February 6, 1940, involved Soviet armor attempting to advance along the frozen lake that Virtanen's position overlooked. Intelligence reports suggested that Soviet forces were planning an assault across the ice, using the lake's flat surface as a route that avoided the dense forest where Finnish defenders could establish ambush positions. The frozen lake offered no cover, but it allowed faster movement than forest trails and created clear fields of fire for any Soviet weapons that established overwatch positions. Virtanen's assignment was straightforward: position himself where he could engage Soviet armor crossing the ice, employ the elephant gun L-39 to disable or destroy vehicles, and withdraw before Soviet forces could locate and engage his position. The mission matched the L-39's intended employment, flanking shots against armor operating in terrain where positioning gave the anti-tank rifle advantages that frontal engagements wouldn't provide. The elephant gun barrel gave him extra penetration that might prove decisive if he encountered vehicles with thicker armor than standard T-26 light tanks. The Soviet assault began around 7:40 hours when Virtanen observed 3 T-26 light tanks moving onto the ice approximately 600 meters from his position. The T-26 was a Soviet light tank that weighed roughly 10 tons, featured armor protection between 6 and 15 millimeters depending on location, carried a 45 millimeter main gun, and represented the most common Soviet armored vehicle that Finnish forces encountered during the Winter War. The relatively thin armor made T-26s vulnerable to anti-tank rifles at ranges where the high-velocity projectiles maintained sufficient energy for penetration. Virtanen settled behind the L-39, positioning the bipod firmly against frozen earth and snow to create a stable platform. The weapon's weight helped with stability. 25 kilograms of rifle, barrel, and ammunition didn't shift easily once positioned. He verified that the 10-round magazine was fully loaded and seated properly, then worked the charging handle to chamber the first round. The clang of the bolt slamming forward was loud enough that he worried Soviet forces might hear it across 600 meters of frozen landscape, though rationally he knew that was impossible. The first target was the lead T-26, presenting its thinner side armor as it moved across the ice. Virtanen estimated range at 580 meters based on terrain features he'd memorized during pre-dawn positioning. He aimed at the junction between the turret and hull, where armor was thinnest and where a penetration might damage either turret mechanisms or hull components. He pressed his cheek firmly against the stock, bracing for what he knew was coming, and squeezed the trigger. The elephant gun L-39 discharged with violence that exceeded even Virtanen's memory from the test firing. The recoil slammed rearward into his shoulder with force that drove him backward against the shallow earth berm he'd built for protection. The muzzle blast created a pressure wave that kicked up snow in a semicircle ahead of his position and temporarily deafened him despite the cold weather cap. The barrel's extended length seemed to amplify every unpleasant characteristic of an already brutal weapon. Downrange, the 20mm projectile struck the T-26's turret ring at roughly 820 meters per second, approximately 70 meters per second faster than a standard barrel would have achieved. The hardened steel penetrator punched through the 8mm side armor, penetrated the turret interior, and created catastrophic damage to whatever mechanical or human elements it encountered. The tank shuddered but continued moving, suggesting the crew wasn't immediately incapacitated, but that internal damage had occurred. Virtanen cycled to his second target without waiting to observe further effects on the first tank. The semi-automatic action had already chambered a fresh round, one advantage the L-39 offered over bolt-action anti-tank rifles that required manual cycling between shots. The second T-26 had reacted to the first shot by attempting to rotate its turret toward Virtanen's position, but the range and the difficulty of locating a single rifle position across 600 meters of terrain meant the Soviet crew was searching rather than engaging. The second shot struck the second T-26 in the hull side, lower than Virtanen had aimed due to range estimation error or wind drift. The impact point was probably 10 millimeters of armor, thicker than the turret but still within the elephant gun barrel's penetration capability at this range. The projectile penetrated, though Virtanen couldn't observe specific internal effects. The tank continued operating, suggesting the hit hadn't caused immediate catastrophic failure. The Soviet third tank had begun reversing, attempting to back off the ice and return to the forest edge where terrain would provide protection. Virtanen fired his third shot at this moving target, leading the tank's motion and aiming at the thinner rear armor. The shot missed, possibly due to motion, possibly due to accumulated recoil affecting his aim, possibly due to the extended barrel's different accuracy characteristics that he hadn't fully mastered. 3 shots fired. Approximately 15 seconds elapsed. Virtanen's shoulder felt like someone had struck it with a sledgehammer 3 times. His ears rang despite the cap. The extended barrel had generated muzzle blast that exceeded what he'd experienced during testing, possibly because the firing angle was different, possibly because atmospheric conditions channeled the pressure waves differently, possibly because consecutive rapid shots created cumulative effects. Soviet forces were now actively searching for his position, with infantry dismounting from trucks at the forest edge and spreading out to locate the anti-tank rifle. Virtanen's tactical doctrine was clear: fire 3 to 5 shots maximum, then withdraw before enemy forces could locate and engage. He'd fired 3 shots, achieved probable damage on 2 vehicles, and needed to displace before Soviet counterfire arrived. Disengaging with the elephant gun L-39 proved more difficult than Virtanen had anticipated. The weapon's 2.55-meter length made it awkward to maneuver through the forest undergrowth where he needed to retreat. The extended barrel caught on branches repeatedly, forcing him to angle the weapon vertically or horizontally to clear obstacles that the standard-length rifle might have navigated more easily. The 25-kilogram weight exhausted him within minutes as he tried to move quickly across snow while carrying the massive rifle. Soviet mortar fire began impacting his previous position approximately 3 minutes after his withdrawal began. Quick reaction that suggested the Soviet forces had located his position through muzzle blast observation or trajectory analysis. The mortar rounds exploded in the area where he'd been positioned, sending fragments whining through the forest and confirming that staying longer would have been fatal. He continued withdrawing, struggling with the elephant gun's bulk until he reached the pre-planned rally point where he could catch his breath and assess the engagement.